I want to say to Jimmy Kemp, whose dad was a great friend and mentor of mine going back to the middle and late 70s. One of the things that's so great about America, whenever we make mistakes, they're man-made mistakes, they can be fixed. They can be fixed. And I'm not here to give a political speech. I want to make a few economic points. But I believe, as an optimist, I believe as a free market guy who believes in economic freedom, I believe as somebody when I began my career, I was a freshly minted Princeton graduate student, and I went to the New York Fed in 1973. Before I went to Wall Street, before I went to Reagan, one of the worst downturns in the history of this country was 1973 to 1975. And if that weren't bad enough, just a few years ago, one of the worst downturns in the history of this country was 1979, 1980, and 1981. And it was a pessimistic, demoralizing period. I've spoken to commencements, college commencements, and reminded them how bad that was when I was a young man. And the great thing is that in the next 25 years, despite all of those setbacks and deep recessions and mistakes on taxes and spending and regulation and inflation and bad money and all the rest of it, we recovered. We recovered. In the next 25 years, America recovered, created 50 million new jobs, dropped the unemployment rate, spurred economic growth, became once again the world's economic leader, and imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, and it was precisely the Reagan free market and supply-side policies that were imitated all across the world in some of the most oppressive countries in the history of mankind changed because of what America did. You're very kind. You're very kind. I'm just stating the obvious. I say this because this is a gloomy period, and this has been a very disappointing period. And I don't even say this in political terms because I believe mistakes were made by both political parties. But here's my point. We can fix this. We can fix this. We will fix this. It will not be perfect, but the great American spirit will live on. We can do this. And that's in some sense what this convention is all about and what this election is all about. And the counter-revolution of big government, Keynesian taxing and spending, which mysteriously took over again in the last 4 or 5 years. I don't know how this happened. I thought we put a spike into that, but you know, Dracula keeps rising. This too will pass. Americans are too sensible to understand. They know what's gone wrong. And that's why I'm an optimist, and I believe this stuff is going to change. Let me make this economic point. I'm really here to make economic points today. If it was going to work, it would have already worked. If it was going to work with over $1 trillion of government spending to state and local governments and unions and work projects that never panned out, and favoritism and crony capitalism and massive borrowing which robbed the private sector of its vitality. If that was going to work, it would have worked, but it hasn't worked. If the Federal Reserve's policy of pumping in over $2 trillion of excess money was going to work, it would have already worked. Do you follow me? It's been now, I agree, Obama inherited a mess. We can debate that, as historians are going to debate that for many years. The precise nature of that mess and the mistakes that were made in the banking system and the mortgage system, I don't. But it's now been over 3 years later. If the spending and the money creation and the regulatory barriers and the hostile attacks on business and the tax the rich, punish success, if that stuff was going to work, it would have already worked. Instead, my friend Kevin Brady, congressman from Texas, a very smart guy, who was the vice chairman of the Joint Economic Committee, has put out study after study showing this to be the worst economic recovery in modern times going back to 1947. We're running roughly 2%. The norm is about 3.5%. At the same period, Reagan was running well over 4%. Jobs are being created. Yes, Ms. Stephanie Cutter can choose whatever baseline she wants. But the reality is, at a comparable period of 28 or 29 months from the bottom, Reagan's revolution, which was private sector and supply side and free market and rewarding success and incentives, had created over 9.5 million jobs by this time. And his growth rate was running 4%, 5%, and 6%. So I return to my theme. If it was going to work, it would have already worked. That is going to be one of the themes of this entire election. I had a session about 2 or 3 months ago with an old friend of mine named Alan Greenspan. He's a very smart guy. He's not perfect. Nobody's perfect. But smart guy. And I asked him, because he's a fiscal expert, really, I asked him how this government spending stimulus was working on the economy. And he said to me, it's had a negative effect. It's actually hurt the economy. It's actually turned Maynard Keynes on his head. In fact, if John Maynard Keynes were alive today, he'd probably completely disagree with the kind of economic policies that were being put forward. What did Greenspan mean? We are creating so much spending, so much borrowing, so much deficits, that any self-respecting business person, man or woman, knows full well that the day of reckoning will come, and at that point, we will have to have some of the largest increases in tax rates in the history of this country in order to avoid bankruptcy. The only problem is those tax rates will make the situation worse, not better. And that is why people are holding back their investment. There's a capital strike going on. Businesses have replaced their equipment and software only to the extent they had to. There is no long-term investment going on, despite profitability. They know that if we stay on this path, the kinds of tax and regulatory policies are going to get worse, and that will hold the growth rate down. We should be growing at 4% instead of 2%. And it's been an absolute waste of time and resources, and I'll come back to this point. You hear Mitt Romney talk about, and I'm very proud of him for this, talk about 4% economic growth as a target. You hear it from his economic advisors, smart guys like Glenn Hubbard and Greg Mankiw and John Taylor, longtime friends of mine, veteran free market economists. After a deep, deep recession, such as we had in the early 70s and the early 80s, we should have had this huge springback. If you're going to fall at 4 to 5% for a year and a half or 2 years, you should be rising at 7, 8, or 9%. We never got that. We never got that. We never got the kick up in jobs. We never got the kick up in wages because I think business took a look at what was going on in Washington and the spending and borrowing and taxing and regulating, and the idea that if you built a business, you don't get any success. It wasn't you who built the business. It was the government that built the business. That hostile attitude towards business and all that goes with it has essentially thwarted the normal animal spirits to rejuvenate the economy and get things moving again. And we never had that this time around because we had chosen the wrong model. And if you choose the wrong model, you're going to get the wrong results.